everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The number that shocked me. Have you ever seen a number so shocking that it made you question everything you believed about the world? A statistic that felt so wrong, so impossible, that you had to read it again and again just to make sure your eyes weren't playing tricks on you? That was me, staring at the US divorce rate for the first time. Feeling like my entire understanding of marriage had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. I remember that day so clearly. I was sitting in my living room in California, scrolling through my phone, when an article caught my eye. Nearly 40 to 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce. I blinked. I read it again. 40 to 50%? That meant almost half. Almost half of all married couples in this country decided to end their marriages. My brain couldn't process it. In my country, divorce was rare. It was shameful. It was something that happened to people who had failed, who hadn't tried hard enough, who had given up too easily. The idea that almost half of all marriages could end was unthinkable. I put down my phone and stared at the wall, my mind racing. How could this be? What was wrong with this country? Did Americans not value marriage? Were they not willing to fight for their relationships? Did they give up at the first sign of difficulty? I felt a wave of judgment wash over me. I looked down at my own wedding ring, the symbol of my commitment to my husband, and I felt proud. I was different. I was better. I would never be one of those statistics. But even as I thought those thoughts, something felt wrong. I didn't know anyone who had been divorced. I had no idea what it was actually like to go through such a thing. I was judging something I didn't understand. And then, a few weeks later, I had a conversation that would completely change everything I thought I knew. A conversation with a friend. A friend who confessed something I never expected. And in that moment, I realized that divorce wasn't what I thought it was. I was about to learn a lesson that would challenge every belief I had ever held about love, marriage, and the meaning of freedom. Judging without knowing. Have you ever been so sure that you were right about something, so absolutely certain that your way of thinking was the only correct way, that you didn't even consider the possibility that you might be wrong? That was me, sitting in my living room, looking at my wedding ring, and feeling proud that I wasn't one of those people who couldn't make their marriage work. I had no idea how wrong I was. The judgment I felt toward people who divorced was deep. It had been planted in me since childhood, watered by every story I had ever heard about marriage and family. In my country, divorce was a dirty word. It was whispered, not spoken. It was something that happened to broken people. It was a mark of failure that followed you forever. When I moved to America, I carried that belief with me. I thought I was better than those who divorced. I thought I was stronger, more committed, more faithful. I looked down on people who couldn't hold their marriages together. I judged them without knowing anything about their lives, their struggles, or their pain. But then, something happened that would crack open my certainty and let the light in. A few weeks after reading that shocking statistic, I was having coffee with a friend. She was an American woman, warm and kind, with 3 beautiful children and a husband who adored her. We had been friends for months, and I admired her deeply. She seemed to have everything I wanted: a happy marriage, a loving family, a beautiful home. Halfway through our conversation, she said something that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. She said, "My first husband, he was not a good man." My brain went blank. First husband? What did she mean, first husband? She saw the shock on my face and smiled gently. "I was married before," she said. "I got divorced when I was 25. It was the hardest thing I ever did. But it was also the best thing." I stared at her, speechless. This woman, this beautiful, kind, successful woman, had been divorced? I had never met anyone who was divorced. I didn't know how to react. My mind was flooded with questions. What had she done wrong? Why couldn't she make it work? What was wrong with her? But as I looked at her, I saw no shame, no regret, no bitterness. I saw peace. I saw strength. I saw a woman who had survived something difficult and come out stronger. And I realized that I had been judging something I knew absolutely nothing about. I had no right to judge her. I had no right to judge anyone. And for the first time, I wanted to understand. A friend's confession. What if the person you admired most had a past you never expected? What if everything you thought you knew about them was only part of the story, and the rest was hidden behind a door you were too afraid to open? That was my friend, sitting across from me at that coffee shop, about to tell me a story that would change everything I believed about love, marriage, and the meaning of failure. I set down my coffee cup, my hands trembling slightly. "You were married before?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes calm and steady. "I was young. 23. I thought I was in love. I thought he was the one. But he wasn't." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "He was controlling. Manipulative. He made me feel small. He made me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I was lucky to have him. And I believed him." I felt my heart sink. "How long did you stay?" 5 years, she said. 5 years of trying to make it work. 5 years of telling myself that if I just tried harder, loved him more, gave him more of myself, he would change. But he never did. She looked down at her hands, and I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes. The day I finally left, I felt like I was dying. I felt like a failure. I felt like I had let everyone down. My parents were devastated. My friends didn't know what to say. And I was so ashamed that I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. She looked up, and her eyes were clear. "But you know what? Leaving him was the bravest thing I ever did. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was also the best. Because staying would have destroyed me." I sat there, speechless. I had never thought about divorce like that. I had always seen it as failure, as giving up, as weakness. But listening to her, I heard something else. I heard courage. I heard strength. I heard a woman who had refused to let someone destroy her. But didn't you feel like you failed? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She smiled softly. I used to. For years. I thought I was broken. I thought I was damaged. I thought no one would ever want me. But then I realized something. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting mine. Staying in a marriage that's killing you isn't strength. It's not a badge of honor. It's not something to be proud of. It's just survival. But leaving? Leaving is a choice. It's a choice to love yourself enough to walk away. I felt tears forming in my eyes. Not sad tears. Overwhelmed tears. Because for the first time in my life, I was seeing divorce differently. I was seeing it not as failure, but as freedom. And I knew I would never judge someone for it again. But then she said something that made me realize I had only scratched the surface. She said, and that's not even the real reason people divorce here, you know? The real reason is something much deeper. The story behind the divorce. What if the real reason people divorce in America isn't what you think? What if it's not about failure, or weakness, or giving up? What if it's something deeper, something that challenges everything you were taught about love, commitment, and what it means to be truly happy? That's what my friend was about to reveal, and it would change my perspective forever. I leaned forward in my chair, my coffee forgotten. What do you mean? I asked. What's the real reason? My friend, let's call her Rachel, took a deep breath and began to speak. In my country, divorce was shameful, she said. But here, in America, I learned something different. I learned that marriage isn't supposed to be a prison. It's supposed to be a partnership. A choice. And if that choice no longer serves you, if it no longer brings you joy or growth or love, you have the right to leave. I frowned, still trying to understand. But what about commitment? What about fighting for your marriage? Rachel nodded. I fought. I fought for 5 years. I went to counseling. I read books. I prayed. I did everything I could to save my marriage. But there was one thing I couldn't change. What? I couldn't change him. And I couldn't change the fact that we had grown into completely different people. We wanted different things. We had different values. We were no longer partners, we were just two people living in the same house, going through the motions. She paused, looking out the window. In America, people believe that you only get one life. One chance to be happy. And if you're spending that one life in a relationship that makes you miserable, you're wasting it. I thought about her words. In my culture, we were taught that marriage was forever, no matter what. That happiness was secondary to duty. That you stayed even if you were miserable, because that's what you were supposed to do. But Rachel was offering me a different perspective. She was saying that staying in an unhappy marriage wasn't strength, it was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of judgment. Fear of the unknown. Divorce isn't easy, she continued. It's one of the hardest things you can do. But sometimes, it's the right thing. Sometimes, it's the only way to find yourself again. I felt tears forming in my eyes. I thought about all the people I had judged over the years. All the couples I had whispered about, thinking they were weak or selfish or broken. I had no idea what they had been through. I had no idea what had led them to that decision. And I realized that I had been wrong. Not just wrong about divorce. Wrong about so many things. But Rachel wasn't finished. She had one more thing to say. One more truth that would shake me to my core and make me question everything I had ever believed about love. My cultural brainwashing. What if everything you believed about marriage was a lie? Not a deliberate lie, but something handed down to you so carefully, so lovingly, that you never thought to question it? Something that felt like truth because you had never been given the chance to see anything else? That was me, sitting in that coffee shop, realizing that my judgment of divorce had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with conditioning. I stared at Rachel, my mind reeling. I had spent my entire life believing that divorce was shameful, that people who divorced were failures, that they hadn't tried hard enough. But sitting there, listening to her story, I realized something I had never considered before. I wasn't born with these beliefs. I was taught them. I was raised in a culture where marriage was sacred, where divorce was a taboo. Where people stayed together no matter what, even if they were miserable, even if they were being hurt, even if they were dying inside. I thought about my grandmother, who had stayed in an unhappy marriage for 50 years because she believed that was what she was supposed to do. I thought about my aunt, who had been miserable with her husband but stayed because she was afraid of being judged by her family. I thought about the whispers I had heard growing up, the stories of people who had failed at marriage, who were broken, who could never be trusted again. And I realized that I had absorbed all of that without question. I had believed it because that was what I was told to believe. I had judged people because that was what I was taught to do. But now, looking at Rachel, I saw something different. I saw a woman who had been brave enough to admit that something wasn't working. A woman who had chosen herself over an idea of what she was supposed to be. A woman who was not broken, but whole. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my own ignorance pressing down on me. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry I ever judged you. I had no idea what you went through." Rachel smiled gently. "You didn't know," she said. "And that's okay. The important thing is that you're willing to learn. Most people never get to that point." And in that moment, I made a decision. I would stop judging. I would stop assuming. I would open my mind to the possibility that everything I thought I knew about love and marriage might be wrong. But I had no idea how hard that journey would be. Because the next step would require me to look at my own marriage in a way I had never looked at it before. And that was terrifying. Understanding freedom. Have you ever had a moment when everything you thought you knew suddenly flipped upside down? When a new idea entered your mind and started breaking down walls you didn't even know you had built? That was me, sitting across from Rachel, feeling the foundations of my beliefs about marriage and divorce slowly shift beneath me. Wondering who I would become on the other side. I walked home from that coffee shop in a daze. My mind was spinning with everything Rachel had told me. Her story. Her pain. Her courage. Her freedom. I kept thinking about what she had said, marriage isn't supposed to be a prison. I had never thought of it that way. In my culture, marriage was a duty. An obligation. A promise you made and kept, no matter what. The idea that you could leave if you were unhappy, that you had the right to choose yourself, was completely foreign to me. But as I walked through my neighborhood, past the beautiful houses with their manicured lawns and happy families, I started to see things differently. I saw a woman jogging with a determined look on her face. I saw a father playing with his kids in the yard. I saw a couple sitting on their porch, holding hands. And I wondered, how many of these people were truly happy? How many of them were staying in their marriages because they wanted to, and how many were staying because they were afraid to leave? I thought about my own marriage. My husband and I were happy. We loved each other. We had built a life together. But I couldn't help asking myself, if I weren't happy, would I stay? Would I feel trapped? Would I have the courage to leave? I realized that I didn't know the answer. Because I had never considered the possibility. I had always assumed that marriage was forever, no matter what. That you stayed even if you were miserable, because that was what you were supposed to do. But Rachel had shown me another way. She had shown me that leaving wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of strength. A sign of self-love. A sign that you refused to accept less than you deserved. I started to see the high divorce rate in a different light. Maybe it wasn't a sign that Americans didn't value marriage. Maybe it was a sign that they valued themselves. Maybe it was a sign that they refused to settle for unhappiness. Maybe it was a sign of freedom. And that thought, that divorce could be freedom, opened something inside me. I started to feel lighter. Less judgmental. More open. I started to understand that everyone had their own journey, their own story, their own reasons. And it wasn't my place to judge them. It was my place to listen, to learn, and to grow. But the hardest lesson was still to come. Because understanding freedom meant looking at my own marriage in a way I had never looked at it before. And that was more terrifying than anything I had ever faced. Marriage is not a prison. Have you ever looked at something you've known your whole life and seen it for the first time? Like a familiar room that suddenly feels different because the light has changed? That was me, looking at my own marriage through new eyes. Wondering if the walls I thought were safe were actually walls I had built around myself without even realizing it. Rachel's words echoed in my mind for days. Marriage isn't supposed to be a prison. I kept turning them over, examining them from every angle. And slowly, I started to see my own marriage differently. Not because anything had changed, but because my perspective had. I started paying attention to the small things. The way my husband and I communicated. The way we handled conflict. The way we made decisions together. I had always assumed we were happy, and we were. But I started to wonder, were we happy because we had a good marriage? Or were we happy because we had never questioned anything? I realized that in my culture, marriage was often about survival. You stayed together because you had to. Because you didn't have a choice. Because leaving was worse than staying. But here, in America, I saw something different. I saw people choosing each other every single day. I saw couples who stayed together not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that made all the difference. I thought about Rachel again. She had been in a marriage that was destroying her. She had made the choice to leave, not because she was weak, but because she was strong. Because she knew that staying would have killed her spirit. Because she believed she deserved more. And I realized that staying in a marriage that is no longer good for you is not a badge of honor. It's not something to be proud of. It's just fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of judgment. Fear of being alone. But what if we could let go of that fear? What if we could see marriage differently? What if we could see it as a choice, not a cage? I started to understand that the high divorce rate in America wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of something else. It was a sign that people were finally valuing themselves enough to walk away from what wasn't working. It was a sign that people were choosing happiness over obligation. It was a sign of freedom. And that freedom wasn't just about leaving. It was about staying too. Because when you know you have the option to leave, every day you stay is a choice. A conscious, deliberate choice. A choice that says, I'm here because I want to be, not because I have to be. That kind of choice is powerful. That kind of choice is love. And I realized that understanding divorce had actually made me appreciate my own marriage more. Not less. But there was still one more lesson I needed to learn. One more truth that would complete the transformation that had begun in that coffee shop. And it came from the most unexpected place of all. A new perspective on my own marriage. Have you ever looked at someone you've known for years and seen them differently? Not because they changed, but because you changed? Because your eyes were finally open to seeing the truth that was always there? That was me, looking at my husband across the dinner table one evening, seeing him not just as my partner, but as a person who chose me, every single day. The realization hit me slowly, like a sunrise spreading across the sky. I had spent so many years believing that marriage was a duty, an obligation, something you did because you had to. But Rachel had shown me another way. She had shown me that marriage could be a choice. A beautiful, conscious, deliberate choice. I started to appreciate my husband in ways I never had before. Not because he was perfect, but because he was present. He was there, every day, choosing to be with me. Choosing to love me. Choosing to build a life with me. And I realized that I had been taking that for granted. I thought about all the times we had argued, all the times we had struggled, all the times we had felt like giving up. But we hadn't given up. We had worked through it. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Because we believed in each other. Because we believed in us. And that made all the difference. I started to understand that the high divorce rate in America wasn't a sign that Americans didn't value marriage. It was a sign that they valued themselves. They refused to stay in situations that were unhealthy, unhappy, or unfulfilling. They chose themselves, and in doing so, they made room for something better. But something else happened too. Something I didn't expect. Understanding divorce made me less afraid of it. Not because I wanted to get divorced, but because I knew I had a choice. I knew that if my marriage ever stopped working, I would have the courage to leave. And knowing that made me feel freer, not less committed. It was like a paradox. The more I accepted that divorce was a possibility, the more I valued my marriage. Because I was choosing it. Every single day. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I started to see marriage differently. Not as a cage, but as a garden. Something that needed to be tended, watered, and cared for. Something that could wither if neglected, but could flourish if nurtured. And I realized that the secret to a happy marriage wasn't staying together no matter what. It was choosing each other every single day. But there was still one more lesson I needed to learn. One more piece of the puzzle that would finally complete my transformation. And it came from the most unexpected place, a conversation with my husband, and a question he asked me that I had never expected. No judgment, just understanding. Have you ever been so certain of your beliefs that you couldn't see the truth standing right in front of you? So convinced that your way was the only way that you missed the beauty of a completely different perspective? That was me, before I finally let go of my judgment and opened my eyes to see what had been there all along. After months of reflection, I had changed. I no longer looked at divorce with judgment. I looked at it with understanding. I looked at it with empathy. I looked at it with respect. And that shift in perspective had opened my heart in ways I never expected. I started having different conversations. When people shared their stories of divorce, I didn't flinch. I didn't judge. I just listened. I listened to the pain, the courage, the hope. I listened to the stories of people who had made the hardest decision of their lives and come out stronger on the other side. One day, I was talking to another friend. She was a successful professional, a mother of two, a woman who seemed to have everything together. I had always admired her. But I had never known her story. I was married for 10 years, she told me. We grew apart. We wanted different things. We tried everything to make it work, but we just couldn't. And when we finally decided to separate, I felt like the biggest failure in the world. I nodded, understanding her pain. But you're not a failure, I said. You're a survivor. She looked at me, surprised. That's not what most people say. Most people think I gave up. I shook my head. You didn't give up. You chose yourself. You chose happiness. You chose to create a life that was authentic and true. And that takes more courage than staying in a marriage that's not working. She smiled, and I saw tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. No one has ever said that to me before. In that moment, I realized something powerful. My judgment had done so much damage, not just to others, but to myself. I had been carrying around so much guilt, so much shame, so many assumptions that weren't true. And letting go of all of that had set me free. I no longer saw divorce as a failure. I saw it as a chapter. A chapter in a person's life that didn't define them, but that shaped them. A chapter that taught them something, that made them stronger, that helped them become who they were meant to be. And I started to see that the high divorce rate in America wasn't a sign that marriage was dying. It was a sign that people were finally brave enough to be honest about what they needed. A sign that people were choosing authenticity over appearances. A sign that people were refusing to settle for less than they deserved. And that was a beautiful thing. But the final lesson was still to come, the lesson that would tie everything together and teach me the ultimate truth about love, marriage, and the meaning of freedom. Divorce is not failure, it's freedom. What if the greatest gift you could give yourself was the permission to let go? What if walking away from something that no longer serves you isn't a sign of weakness, but the bravest act of self-love you could ever perform? That was the final truth I discovered, sitting in my living room, holding my husband's hand, feeling more grateful for our marriage than I ever had before. It was a quiet evening. The children were asleep. The house was still. My husband and I were sitting on the couch, talking about nothing in particular, when I suddenly felt the need to say something I had never said before. "I'm glad you're here," I said. "I'm glad you chose me." He looked at me, a little confused. "Of course I chose you," he said. "I choose you every day." I smiled, tears forming in my eyes. Because in that moment, I understood everything. I understood that the high divorce rate in America wasn't a tragedy. It was a testament to the courage of people who refused to settle. People who believed they deserved more than a life of misery. People who were brave enough to start over. I thought about all the people I had judged over the years. All the whispered stories, the shaken heads, the pitying looks. I had been so wrong. So blind. So trapped in my own narrow worldview. But now, I saw clearly. Divorce wasn't the end of love. Sometimes, it was the beginning of self-love. Sometimes, it was the only way to find yourself again. Sometimes, it was the path to freedom. I realized that staying in a marriage that's destroying you isn't strength, it's fear. But leaving? Leaving is courage. Leaving is choosing yourself. Leaving is saying, "I deserve more." And that's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. I also realized that understanding divorce didn't make me want to leave my husband. It made me want to stay more. Because now, I wasn't staying out of obligation. I was staying out of choice. I was choosing him every single day, because I wanted to. Because he made me happy. Because he made me whole. And that choice was the most beautiful thing in the world. I looked at my husband, this man who had stood by me through everything, and I felt a surge of love so powerful it took my breath away. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you for choosing me too." He squeezed my hand and smiled. "Always," he said. I realized that my journey had come full circle. I had started with judgment, moved through understanding, and arrived at love. I had learned that divorce is not the opposite of marriage. It's the courage to say that you deserve better. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is let go, so you can find the life you were always meant to live. That, I realized, was the true meaning of freedom.